Rosehip oil didn't rise because it suddenly became powerful. It rose because it became easier to explain. And when something becomes easier to explain, the process behind it has usually been simplified, quietly, long before the bottle reaches the shelf. Rosehip oil didn't become a miracle because it suddenly changed. It became a miracle because the world around it changed quietly, slowly, and without announcing itself. For a long time, rosehip oil existed without urgency, without labels promising transformation, and without the pressure to perform instantly. It was not something people searched for obsessively, and it was not treated as a shortcut. It simply existed as a material shaped by time, climate, patience, and limitation, moving at the rhythm of nature rather than demand. Back then, rosehip oil was not expected to solve problems. It wasn't framed as an answer. It wasn't surrounded by language designed to persuade. It passed through systems that respected its fragility and accepted its inconsistencies. Variation was not a defect, and unpredictability was not a flaw. It was understood that this oil could not be rushed, simplified, or forced into rigid timelines without consequences. But silence does not scale, and complexity does not travel easily. At some point, that quiet balance became inconvenient. And when inconvenience enters a system driven by growth, adaptation begins. This story is not about what rosehip oil does today. It is about what had to change, what had to be removed, and what had to be reshaped so that rosehip oil could exist everywhere, consistently, and without friction. Once you understand that process, you stop seeing oils as miracles and start seeing them as outcomes. Before rosehip oil was framed as a solution, it was simply an ingredient with limits that could not be negotiated. Its value existed inside narrow harvest windows, careful handling, and a relationship with time that demanded respect. You did not rush rosehip oil because rushing it introduced loss. You did not force it to behave uniformly because uniformity was never its strength. People who worked with it understood this intuitively and adapted themselves to the material rather than trying to adapt the material to systems. In that earlier stage, rosehip oil did not need to look identical from batch to batch. Differences in aroma, texture, and color were expected outcomes of natural variation. There was no pressure to eliminate these differences because there was no promise being made to a mass audience. The oil existed within a smaller ecosystem where context mattered more than consistency, and where expectation was shaped by experience rather than marketing language. Because there was no promise, there was no disappointment. Rosehip oil did not need to perform on demand or deliver instant results. It moved quietly through processes that accepted its fragility as part of its identity. That balance worked precisely because demand remained modest. But demand rarely stays modest, and when it begins to grow, systems stop adapting to materials and start reshaping them instead. Rosehip is not forgiving, and once it is harvested, time becomes a visible force. Exposure to air, fluctuations in temperature, and delays that seem insignificant at first begin to accumulate. Oxidation does not announce itself dramatically, and it does not arrive all at once. It builds gradually, layer by layer, minute by minute, altering the oil long before changes become obvious. As interest in rosehip oil increased, the natural buffers that once protected it began to disappear. Harvest windows tightened, schedules replaced patience, and speed became a requirement rather than a choice. The plant itself did not change, but the rhythms surrounding it did. What once depended on timing and care now depended on coordination, logistics, and efficiency. Pressure does not immediately destroy processes, it reshapes them. To keep up with growing demand, systems had to intervene in ways that were not loud or dramatic. Adjustments were made quietly, often framed as improvements. These changes were not designed to harm the oil, but they were designed to make it move faster. And when speed becomes the priority, something else inevitably gives way. Between the field and the factory, rosehip oil enters its most fragile phase, where nature meets logistics. Transport introduces waiting, storage introduces uncertainty, and distance introduces risk. To protect the oil from degradation during this stage, conditions must be controlled with increasing precision. Temperature, containers, timing, and handling protocols replace intuition and experience. At this point, preservation is no longer the only goal. Survival through predictability becomes the priority. Systems begin to favor versions of the oil that tolerate delays, storage, and movement more effectively. Small variations that once defined character start to disappear, not because they are harmful, but because they are inconvenient within large-scale operations. When inconvenience becomes expensive, it is removed. What survives transport is not always what defines origin. Instead, what survives is what behaves consistently under pressure. This shift happens gradually, but once it takes hold, the process no longer revolves around honoring the material. It revolves around ensuring that the material fits the system. Inside the factory, rosehip oil becomes measurable and controlled. Pressure is calculated, temperature is monitored, and outcomes are expected to remain consistent. Extraction is no longer primarily about preservation. It becomes an exercise in management. Anything unstable is corrected, anything unpredictable is filtered out, and anything that complicates repetition is quietly removed from the process. The oil becomes cleaner, more uniform, and more reliable. On paper, these changes appear positive. Efficiency improves, waste decreases, and output becomes easier to predict. But something subtle changes during this transition. The oil begins to lose the characteristics that once required patience and careful attention. What remains is easier to repeat, and repetition becomes the dominant value. This shift is rarely framed as loss, because loss is difficult to measure. Instead, the focus stays on improvement, optimization, and control. Over time, the process favors what behaves well under machines rather than what reflects origin, and the distinction becomes invisible to anyone who only sees the final product. Refinement is often described as progress, but in reality, refinement is negotiation. To exist at scale, rosehip oil must behave consistently across environments, shelves, and timelines. It must tolerate long storage periods, repeated transportation, and varying conditions without noticeable change. To achieve this, edges soften, depth reduces, and complexity fades. The oil becomes dependable rather than expressive. Dependability is rewarded not because it is inherently better, but because it is manageable. Systems built around scale require materials that conform, and anything that resists conformity is quietly excluded. Rosehip oil adapts not because it chooses to, but because adaptation is the only way to remain present within these systems. At this stage, the oil no longer depends on patience, variation, or time. It depends on stability. And stability becomes the new definition of quality, even though it represents a fundamentally different relationship with the material than before. Once refined, rosehip oil fits easily into stories designed to travel. Dark bottles signal protection, minimal labels signal purity, and simple language signals trust. The factory disappears from view, the harvest fades into abstraction, and the process becomes invisible. What reaches the consumer is not the journey, but the conclusion. This version of rosehip oil is easy to understand, easy to repeat, and easy to believe in. Shelf life becomes reassurance, consistency becomes comfort, and simplicity becomes the selling point. The story replaces explanation, because explanation requires time, and time resists scale. Belief travels faster than complexity ever could. And once belief takes hold, the process no longer needs to be seen to be accepted. What remains is not deception, but selection. A version of rosehip oil designed to survive everywhere, under all conditions, without requiring patience or adaptation from the system. The miracle was not created in the bottle. It was shaped long before, through a series of decisions that favored scale over complexity. The real transformation happened when complexity became inconvenient and was gradually removed. Once this pattern becomes visible, it stops being unique to rosehip oil. It appears across ingredients, products, and industries wherever scale demands conformity. Rosehip oil did not become a miracle by accident. It became a miracle by adaptation. Understanding ingredients is not about memorizing promises or benefits. It is about recognizing what had to be removed so that those ingredients could exist at scale. If this perspective changed how you see rosehip oil, stay with the channel. Each video explores what quietly changes before products reach your routine. Subscribe to continue the series and share your thoughts below, because your perspective may shape the next story.